America.
Stream now on the free CBS News app.
When it comes to the money you spend every day, we have you covered every morning. Making money makes sense. Weekdays on CBS Mornings.
It's a history-making meeting. 4 extraordinary women who are all 4-star generals and admirals.
How did you deal with being discriminated against?
I just worked harder.
The future of an ever-evolving U.S. military when we go person to person.
We have a gun violence epidemic in America.
He's trying to undermine the constitutional right of law-abiding citizens, and that's not going to happen.
And we made a commitment to America that we would lower your energy costs. That's exactly what this bill does.
The targeting of American citizens by Russian government is unacceptable.
I am urging the administration to do everything they can to get him free.
I think the candidate is probably not announced yet that will be our nominee in 2024.
I'm proud that when the world went mad, when common sense suddenly became an uncommon virtue, that Florida stood as a refuge of sanity.
Welcome to Red and Blue. I'm Robert Costa in Washington. Thanks for joining us. After a busy week on Capitol Hill, members of Congress are leaving town for 2 weeks with no action on the looming debt limit, and there has been no action on gun legislation either after Monday's school shooting in Nashville. And news overnight of a Wall Street Journal reporter arrested in Russia. We'll have the response from the White House and State Department in a moment. But we begin on Capitol Hill. Outside the House chamber yesterday, 2 members of Congress got into a shouting match over the issue of gun legislation. And today, House Speaker Kevin McCarthy expressed doubts that legislation could stop more mass shootings.
We will look, getting all the information, is there anything that we can do more? But I would say to a nation as a whole, that the problem that we are today, it's not just going to be a legislation. We've got to have a severe conversation here with this country. We've got to deal with mental illness.
CBS News congressional correspondent Scott McFarland joins us now. Scott, good to have you here with us at the table. Gun legislation. Where does it go from here?
It has to start to go somewhere. And at this moment, they're paralyzed in Congress on what to do about this. And you can tell they're paralyzed legislatively for 3 reasons. There are no committee hearings scheduled in the U.S. House on new gun restrictions or gun control. There's no bipartisan meetings of note or legislation in the works. And third, you saw the scene last night, a confrontation between Congressman Bowman of New York and Congressman Massey of Kentucky. Those type of messaging moments are what happen when the legislative gears have ground to a halt. And that's where we are at this moment in time. Bit of a sea change from the last Congress when we had gun control legislation passed, something that was at the same time the biggest gun control bill in a generation and something considered way too incremental and small by gun control activists.
What about something like Toomey Mansion? We've seen consensus in the past decade for occasional moments after mass shootings where parties come together and think about incremental changes to background checks. If there was anything on the policy front that was possible in this tenuous political moment, what would it be?
The phrase background checks comes up from both parties. There are some Republicans, Brian Fitzpatrick of Pennsylvania, who've talked about background checks being something that could get Republican support. Chris Murphy of Connecticut is always talking about background checks, saying they are distinctively popular with the American public. But there's nothing above the surface in this Congress for background checks, other gun control measures. They're not even speaking the same language. The Republicans in the House had a hearing about overreach by the Department of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, by that federal bureau, where Democrats in the Senate are talking about the need to ban assault weapons. These are 2 different wavelengths and planes upon which they're playing.
And sometimes here at CBS News, Scott, I feel like you have more insight into West Virginia than others here. You've done some great stories out there. I loved your story on the Greenbrier and the national security history of that site. But also, you keep a close eye on Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia. What's up with Senator Manchin this week, especially his relationship with President Biden?
Well, consider the backstory here, and it's a rich one. He has a looming challenger if he runs for re-election in the Senate in 2024, who is formidable. The very popular Republican governor who could easily, because he's a billionaire, self-fund a campaign. So
Jim Justice, right?
Jim Justice. So Joe Manchin has that playing in the background as he tries to figure out his next move. He is hypercritical of President Biden in a new editorial in the Wall Street Journal about the implementation of that bill that is attached to both of their names, the Inflation Reduction Act that Joe Manchin and Joe Biden worked together to pass. Critical of Biden, perhaps to justify any flaws in popularity or politically of that bill, but also to try to lean on the president to perhaps implement it in a different way. All of this with the open-ended question of what does Joe Manchin, always a pivotal figure, do next? Does he run for re-election? Does he run for a different office? Does he call it a career? Every move he makes begs that intriguing question, and right now, Bob, there's no answer.
Some of my Republican donor sources say they would like to see Manchin run for president. It's interesting. Manchin was one of the key votes early on in the Biden presidency on the American Rescue Plan. So that always hovers over his political decisions as well as he looks toward 2024. Scott McFarland, we know you're tracking it all. Thanks for being here. And as we mentioned, the Biden administration is responding to Russia's arrest of an American journalist. The State Department has been in touch with the Wall Street Journal reporter's family and is working to secure access to him.
I know all of you are incredibly concerned about the reports coming out of Russia today, as am I, as is the entire department. I want to say clearly and unequivocally in the strongest terms, we condemn the Kremlin's continued attempts to intimidate, repress, and punish journalists and civil society voices.
For more on this developing story, CBS News correspondent Christina Ruffini joins us now from the White House. Christina, thanks for being here. Tell us more about the White House's response to this situation.
Well, first of all, they were asked about the charges, these charges of espionage. It's a very serious accusation, especially coming from the Russians. And the press secretary today called those charges ridiculous. She said this is a reporter. There's no foundation to these charges. Now, she was also asked if she would say that Evan had never worked for the U.S. government. She just kept repeating these charges are ridiculous, they're unfounded, and the U.S. is trying to establish some sort of consular support for him. But it doesn't sound like they've been able to do that yet. Now, when it comes to espionage charges, this is different than some of the other charges we've seen with Americans detained in Russia. This tends to be high profile and something that the FSB and the Kremlin like to do to individuals they plan to hold on to for some sort of strategic purpose, possibly a trade in the future.
Christina, do we know anything more about why the Russians are making these claims?
We don't. And I asked the press secretary, what precipitated this now? This Wall Street Journal reporter has been working in Russia for quite some time. He's a very experienced individual. I talked to some people who know him. They said he's a lovely guy. Why now? Why pick him up now? And the White House said it's very early stages. They don't know. They didn't want to get ahead of any information. But that's going to be key. There was a Russian detained in the U.S. last week. So it's unclear if that's related. It may be, it may not be, or they may have some sort of larger plan. There's also an individual detained in Germany that the Russians had tried to trade other American detainees, including Brittany Griner and Paul Whelan, for. As we know, Paul Whelan is still in detention. The Germans would not give up that individual, and that trade did not go through. So with Russian foreign policy, they're using Americans as kind of chips to hold until they need to be played. And the White House and the State Department have emphasized that's why they've declared it a level 4 do not travel. They're urging any Americans in the country to leave. They say the State Department will help facilitate that exit, and Americans should not go there because of the risk of political arrest like we're seeing here.
Christina, could this have a chilling effect on press coverage of Putin and the Russians? I'm already seeing reports of some reporters being pulled out of the country for safety reasons.
Well, look, there's already been a chilling effect on press coverage in Russia. As you know, soon after the invasion, the Kremlin passed new laws that were media control laws. Basically, you're not allowed to speak critically of the war, of the Russian government, of Vladimir Putin, or you risk arrest. So a lot of outlets, including ours, pulled a lot of assets out of Moscow after that for fear of something like this. Now, there are still a few who have been able to work inside the country. I actually didn't know Wall Street Journal had a reporter in there, but I know a few other outlets do. And it's always a very fine line. If you listen to the reports, they have to be very careful about what they can say and what they can imply, because they're trying not to draw the ire of the Russian government. But I think you might see even some of those last few, you might see newsrooms all over the country, especially in boardrooms, reevaluating whether they really want to put their people in risk by leaving them in Moscow. Of course, the issue is if there's no press coverage, that's not a good thing for democracy, and that's not a good thing for Russia. There are outlets like TV Rain and others that were some of the few independent stations left. Most of them have shut down or had to leave the country. There are a lot of those reporters have gone to places like Radio Free Europe, and they're essentially doing Cold War tactics, trying to beam that signal of nonpartisan objective news back across where the Iron Curtain used to be, because free press is on its last limbs anywhere in Moscow, if it even has that to stand on.
Christina Ruffini at the White House. Thank you.
Thank you.
A federal judge struck down multiple provisions of the Affordable Care Act that could jeopardize preventative screenings for millions of Americans. Judge Reed O'Connor's ruling blocks some insurers from covering preventative care such as HIV drugs, cancer, and mental health screenings. This comes 4 years after the same Texas judge ruled the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare, was unconstitutional. That ruling was overturned by the U.S. Supreme Court. The Biden administration is expected to appeal O'Connor's latest ruling. And former House Intelligence Chairman Mike Rogers considering jumping into the 2024 presidential race. What he told me about that consideration, we'll have that next. You're streaming Red and Blue, reporting across the political divide.
Hey there, welcome to The Uplift.
I thought she was a groom, and I stepped back and I went, oh, you're the queen. She's gonna be with me every instant that I'm alive.
I just wanted to see if you'd go to Disneyland with me today.
I look over at him and he's smiling.
I'm gonna remember that the rest of my life.
They told us when he was gonna be born, he was only gonna live for 30 minutes. It's really a miracle that he's with us today.
The Uplift. Stream now on the free CBS News app.
When you wake up in the morning, we want to be your go-to team.
On our places, bright, shiny faces.
I don't go to work in the morning. I go for coffee with my two good friends, and we talk about the world.
Your morning routine just got better. CBS Mornings.
An original documentary from CBS reports.
I always tell people that Twitter would not be Twitter without Black Twitter. It's just us being in fellowship with each other.
And there becomes a conversation you don't want to be left out of.
People really started to recognize the power of activism on Twitter.
Based on that one tweet, the hashtag #OscarSoWhite was trending around the world.
If anything has really powered Black Twitter, it's been humor.
If your food ain't right, oh, we're gonna tell you about that too.
We tend to create change, create culture and cool.
That's how movements happen on Black Twitter and go beyond more than that.
Black Twitter, the Twitterverse that changed a generation. Now streaming on the free CBS News app.
You ready? A generation of kids opens up on CBS Reports.
I just want to be like a regular kid.
Their world, their struggles, their voices.
What if I was white?
A lot of people like to call names and make you feel ashamed for being proud of who you are.
Now streaming Gender.
I did not realize that you could change your gender.
Realizing how you feel.
You can be a boy, and sometimes you feel like a girl, sometimes you feel like both.
Redefining who you are.
I identify as trans.
Gender fluid.
Non-binary and queer.
Is the idea of gender a thing of the past?
And to be yourself, always, no matter what anyone says, I love you.
Are the kids all right? Gender. Now streaming on the free CBS News app.
Stories that inform.
Or you can be really old at 60, and you can be really young at 85.
Inspire.
How do we unlock the power within ourselves to be who we want to be?
And brighten your day.
The best part of fame is making people feel good. Always send the people home happy.
Make every day a little more like Sunday morning.
Here comes the sun.
Stream now on the free CBS News app.
The news doesn't have to always be depressing.
What do you love about running?
It can be uplifting. That human connection that we create on the broadcast every night is incredibly important.
Welcome back to Red and Blue. The Republican presidential field for 2024 still taking shape. And earlier today, I spoke with someone who's considering a run, an outside one, former Michigan Republican Congressman Mike Rogers. We began by asking him about a possible bid.
I've spent the last 7 years as a businessman in the tech space, primarily cybersecurity, but working with quantum computing and AI. And through that experience, and then I look back at my government experience, there is a lot we can do to modernize the government. And one day, my wife and I got up, we were having a cup of coffee, and we said, something's broken. I mean, nothing feels right. And the people that we've met over the last 12 months are really politically discouraged. They're thinking that maybe politics doesn't work anymore, the government doesn't work anymore. So that's why we founded LEAD. Could we have a better, more hopeful, optimistic message about who we are as Americans? And could we create real solutions to really hard problems? And so, Robert, that's taken me to New Hampshire and Iowa and South Carolina, and I've met a lot of folks. And so we're obviously we're kicking some tires, and we're thinking, is this the right thing to do to bring a different kind of perspective to the 2024 race? And we'll probably know within a few months if that's the right decision.
Have you set a firm timeline for yourself about a decision?
Not a firm timeline, but we think maybe late spring, early summer is the right time to do it. Everyone else is going to get kicked off by then, and that would probably be the right time if you are going to jump into the race.
So we're thinking about May or June for you to make a decision?
May or June sounds about right.
So you're not maybe angling to be in that first debate this summer. You're taking your time to think it through.
Well, I mean, obviously, this is nobody should be Pollyannish about jumping into something as monumental as running for president of the United States. And so what we've been doing, Robert, is just the last few months talking to real people with real issues about inflation and jobs and the economy and what in God's green earth is happening internationally. It looks like everyone's flicking us in the head. And talking about all those issues. And I think we need a little more time to see if they are ready, voters are ready in places that matter for a different kind of a conversation. So far, we've been really pleasantly surprised. So if we get in that first debate or don't, that won't be the determinant for us to make that announcement.
When you were making these visits to early voting states, I think back to Jimmy Carter when he first ran for president in the 1970s. Some people in Iowa, in New Hampshire, they'd go, Jimmy who? If they go, Mike who, what do you say? What's your very short introduction about who you are and why you're thinking about running?
America needs something different, number one. Very rarely do you have a candidate who has been experienced in fixing tough problems in the federal government, as well as business experience, solid business experience in the new generation of jobs. Wouldn't it be great if we could combine that person and get them into a candidate? Candidly, I think that's exactly what gets me in the door. And people are inviting me back, more importantly, to hear the solutions.
If you ran, you would certainly run your own race, it seems. I'm just trying to understand where you stand on Trump. If he became the nominee, would you support him as the Republican nominee?
Listen, I don't believe today, as I'm sitting here, that Donald Trump will be the Republican nominee in 2024. Don't believe it. And so that's my belief. That certainly takes me out and around. He may actually stay in for a while. I just don't think I believe he will be there. His troubles are mounting, his fundraising is waning, and again, I've had people show up with the red hats at different conversations that we're having with something called Lead America. And they end up saying, hey, would you come to my group and talk about this stuff? We haven't heard this kind of conversation. And that's what I think is going to happen. I think the candidate is probably not announced yet that will be our nominee in 2024.
You are a former FBI agent. The former president, as you said, is now facing legal challenges, potentially an arrest, an indictment in New York due to the Manhattan grand jury investigating him over hush money payments made by Michael Cohen, his former fixer. As a former FBI agent, how do you see the prospect of a former president possibly being indicted and arrested?
Honestly, I haven't. I'd like to see the indictment. I haven't read it yet.
Well, he hasn't been indicted.
I know that, but it's my understanding it's printed and aired, meaning it's already sitting on someone's desk. I think they're going to need to make the Department of Justice, the DA is going to have to make a decision on what is justice and what is revenge and what is punitive, in a sense that doesn't, meet all the standards of Lady Justice being blind. And I think they're going to have hard conversations. If you're going to indict a former president, given the environment of which we are in, my argument is this has to be a better case than certainly I have seen outlined in the press. So that's why I say I'd have to see the affidavit if you were indicted.
You said that you believe the indictment's already drafted. Where did you hear that?
I do believe it's been drafted, absolutely.
Who told you that?
Listen, I get around. Listen, I just think that it's there. They need to decide if they're going to sign it and stamp it. I think that's where we're at on that whole thing. And I hope they are having second thoughts. I mean, again, there's justice and then there's revenge. And we need to make sure that people have faith in the system from the top to the bottom. And I think this kind of a thing, not done properly, rattles people's faith and it drives people further apart. The last thing we need in America today is to drive people further apart than we already are.
Prosecutors investigating a payment made to adult film actor Stormy Daniels have been looking into alleged payments to a second woman who has an alleged association with former President Donald Trump. Sources close to the case say witnesses have been repeatedly questioned in the investigation about a $150,000 payment to former Playboy model Karen McDougal. She has claimed to have an affair with the former president more than a decade ago, which his legal team denies. McDougal sold her story to the National Enquirer before the 2016 election, but it never ran. The former CEO of the Enquirer recently testified before the grand jury just earlier this week. And Florida Governor Ron DeSantis spoke in Georgia earlier today. We'll take you to the Peach State and see where Republican voters stand on the race for the 2024 Republican nomination. You're streaming Red and Blue.
An original documentary from CBS reports. Controversial Congressman George Santos.
Why won't you answer our questions?
How did he manage to get elected?
Thank you very much, and God bless you, and God bless the USA.
George Santos' campaign was a campaign of deceit, lies, fabrication.
And who is he, really?
I knew him as Anthony DeVolder from Queens.
Really, who he is, he's a fraud.
I compare him to the Tinder swindler.
From people who know him, the truth, the facts, the lies.
He would say that he was worth $100 million.
It's an incredibly cynical episode in American politics, beyond satire.
Had you ever seen anything like this?
No, and I hope I never see it again.
Campaign of Deceit, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
She dazzled on the court and off the court as a businesswoman.
Thank you for joining us on Person to Person. Tennis superstar and entrepreneur Serena Williams.
An original CBS Reports documentary.
I asked my students, what are we going to do about racism in the United States?
The backlash over teaching about racism in American schools.
I don't think it has any place in the classroom.
We can either pretend and say, no, we're not racist and we're all great people, or we can actually start to do the really, really hard work of addressing it.
How did you lose your job?
I made the statement that white privilege is a fact.
Is it helping diversity and inclusion?
When you bring in different people's stories and experience, it enriches education.
If you don't talk about something, it doesn't go away.
Or driving us further apart?
What schools are doing to our children in the name of anti-racism is in fact teaching them racism.
The intention is to put us in this war against each other.
An original CBS Reports documentary, streaming now. An original CBS Reports documentary.
I was entitled to equal pay for equal work under the law.
Does the Supreme Court's power need to be checked?
9 Supreme Court justices, 5 of them said no, she's not entitled. That's not right.
Calls to fix the court tend to go along with the politics of the moment.
Republican-appointed justices have all tended to go in one direction, with the Democratic-appointed justices tending to go in another.
Even though it's only 9 justices, it takes 5 of them to make the law of the land.
Does it have political impact? True. Political intent? Probably not true.
If the American people don't trust the judgment of their court, that's a real problem for our democracy.
An original CBS Reports documentary streaming now.
When you wake up in the morning, we want to be your go-to team.
Your morning routine just got better. CBS Mornings.
Welcome back to Red and Blue. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis was outside Atlanta, Georgia today to continue his book tour. He spoke at Adventure Outdoors, and according to the store, they are the largest gun store in the country. Many have considered DeSantis' tour as a prelude to a 2024 campaign launch. Several recent polls have Trump's lead over the Republican governor growing, something DeSantis appeared to confront head-on.
A leader is not captive to public opinion or poll. First of all, a lot of these polls are wrong, but they're not captive to polls. A leader will get ahead of public opinion. A leader will shape public opinion, and a leader will bring people to his side.
News political reporter Aaron Navarro joins us from Smyrna, Georgia. Aaron, thanks for being here. Why did Governor DeSantis choose to appear at this particular store?
Hi, Bob. Thanks for having me. And while this event was announced last weekend before the shooting in Tennessee, it is notable this place boasts having 10,000 guns on their sign. But he's tapping into, and he began with the remarks you just mentioned, he's tapping into this issue of gun rights that conservatives have been riled up on for years now. And he began his remarks talking about that before kind of going into his speech. But it is notable. He did cancel his or postpone his event next Monday in Tennessee with Governor Bill Lee, and that would be the 1-week mark since the Covenant shooting. So it's notable he still decided to hold this event, but maybe more so because it was already on the calendar.
Is he taking on former President Trump directly in his Q&A and his public remarks today?
Bob, in the couple times I've covered DeSantis, he doesn't really take Q&As from the crowd, and he doesn't really mention the former president at all, though I did note he kind of criticized the First Step Act, not directly, but almost indirectly, talking about criminals that have been re-released onto the streets. This is a landmark criminal justice act that former President Trump passed and that DeSantis voted for, but he brought up the incident of Senator Rand Paul's staffer being stabbed in D.C. earlier this week, noting that criminals have been re-released and all they do is offend. And he put a good amount of time into law and order remarks, which has been reported as something, an issue that he could draw some more contrast with Trump on. But in the events I've seen, he doesn't take questions really from the crowd or press, and he doesn't take on Trump, at least directly by name.
What is the timeline for Governor DeSantis? Not just what he says publicly, Aaron, but what you're hearing from sources and donors close to him.
What I'm hearing is consistent from what we reported, is that after the legislative session ends in May. They note it's fluid. I've heard June, early June, as a potential more solid marking in the calendar, but they've generally said, and he said as well, after the legislative session ends in May, that's when I'll start to make a final decision. And we keep asking folks every week, and they tell us the same thing. So around early summer is what I'm anticipating.
Aaron, what else are you hearing about Governor DeSantis' decision?
Well, if you look at his calendar in April, it is pretty packed and suggests the map leading to a former run, or a potential run. He is going to New Hampshire, the early presidential primary state. I've heard from 2 sources involved in the governor's orbit that he could be heading to South Carolina and Nevada as well. Those are both early presidential primary states. He's also going to battleground states. He's going to Pennsylvania this Saturday, Ohio, and Michigan. So if you look at his travel, as well as a trip to Israel in late April, it suggests someone that is looking to reintroduce himself to voters, get his name out there ahead of launching an actual official 2024 run.
Aaron Navarro, thank you.
Thanks,
and Ukrainian Ambassador Oksana Marakova threw out the ceremonial first pitch before the Washington Nationals opening day game on Thursday. Makarova fired a strike in front of the D.C. faithful at Nationals Park. She joins prominent U.S. figures such as former Presidents Barack Obama and George W. Bush as individuals who have thrown the ceremonial first pitch in D.C. The Nationals lost their season opener 7-2 to the Atlanta Braves. That does it for today. You can stream Red and Blue Monday to Thursday at 5 p.m. Eastern. You're streaming CBS News.
In today's Money Watch, business analyst Jill Schlesinger is here to help.
How do you even begin to make the best use of your money?
If you've got a match from your employer, don't give away that money.
Dollar Jill, y'all.
CBS Mornings, starting at 7.
An original documentary from CBS reports.
The carnage in our nation's schools has become painfully repetitive.
Not one more child!
School shootings have parents fighting mad.
I promised my daughter I was going to fight. I was going to keep on